Welcome to History 338, History of Japan. This is week 5. So we're launching towards World War II in this week's lecture, and also going to look at the American occupation of Japan after the end of World War II. On July 7th of 1937, Japanese troops on maneuver at the Marco Polo Bridge near Beijing in China were supposedly fired upon by the Chinese. This led to an escalation that resulted in outright war between Japan and China. The fighting spread to Shanghai, China, which fell by November of 1937. But perhaps what shocked the world more than anything else was what occurred at Nanjing, which was the capital of Chiang Kai-shek's government, the nationalist government in China at that time. In December of 1937, Japanese troops looted the city of Nanking, murdering, raping, and torturing many. It was one of the most notorious atrocities in human history. The Chinese claimed that there were 340,000 casualties. The Japanese say it was only about 10% of that. Some of these atrocities were filmed. And Emperor Hirohito's younger brother, Prince Mikasa, was stationed in Nanjing at the time and acknowledged in an interview for a newspaper years later that a massacre did, in fact, take place. Japan was very upset by Germany in August 1939. And that was because Germany signed a non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union. And if you recall, the Japanese had signed with the Germans an anti-Comintern pact, and this was totally against that pact. The Japanese were not only offended by this, but they were offended by Hitler and his whole proclamation of the superiority of the Aryan race, of the white race, and his descriptions of the Japanese really as second-class people. The World War II really began to actually rev up in September of 1939 when Germany attacked Poland, and, we see that as kind of the official beginning of World War II. Germany was very successful, and Japan signed a tripartite pact with Germany and Italy. That pact was signed in September of 1940. And the main points of it included an agreement that these three powers would come to each other's aid should there be an attack by a nation not currently involved in either the war in Europe or the war between China and Japan. Now, that meant, and everyone knew what that meant in case the United States became involved. What the Tripartite Pact also recognized is Japan's interest in Asia. And Japan's interests were kind of amorphously defined as a Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. And this is all dating back to those ideas of Musubi and Tennosei and all of the other stuff where the Japanese believed that they were, superior, more connected to nature than the Europeans were, and that they would need to liberate, Asia from Western imperialism. And this Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere was really ill-defined. It was rather amorphous. Some versions of it had Japan even, kind of liberating countries such as Australia and New Zealand. And of course, if one wants to talk about a euphemism and about, putting a positive kind of media PR spin on things, the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere is certainly that kind of euphemism. In 1940, Japanese troops moved into French Indochina. The French had colonies in Southeast Asia, namely Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia. And when the Japanese troops moved into, French Indochina, the U.S. was quite upset And the U.S. response was to limit exports from America, from the U.S. to Japan, of such items as scrap iron, steel, aviation fuel. Okay, so already by 1940, exports to Japan are being limited. And as we know, Japan was very much dependent upon raw materials coming from elsewhere because geographically they were not blessed with these kinds of minerals and raw materials. In 1941, Germany reneged on its non-aggression pact with the Soviet Union, and Germany just outright attacked the Soviet Union. Well, that actually gave some comfort to Japan because Japan had always worried about the Soviet Union, about how Russia, had been moving right during the late 19th and early 20th centuries into Asia. And now it didn't need to worry about the Soviet Union attacking Manchuria because the Soviet Union was more concerned about defending itself from Germany and on the European front. So the Japanese felt that they could look southward, and they looked more to Malaya, that is to Malaysia, and to the Dutch East Indies, which we now know as Indonesia. These places were resource rich, and the Japanese decided to move further south into Indochina. The U.S., upset by these steps, froze Japanese assets in the United States. And besides freezing those Japanese assets in the U.S. imposed a comprehensive export embargo on American goods to Japan. Now, this included the very vital commodity of oil, and we know that Japan depended on imports for more than 90% of its oil, and of that, more than 3/4 of that 90% of oil it depended upon came from the United States. Kind of amazing, but the United States back then was a huge oil exporter. Well, things are happening in President Franklin Delano Roosevelt's government. At one point in time, he approved document JB 355 aircraft requirements of the Chinese government. He was going to supply U.S.-built Lockheed Hudson and Douglas bombers to China to destroy factories in Japan. Now, this plan was never carried out, and some say it was probably best that it wasn't because it would have been a failure because Japan had its own state-of-the-art bombers, namely the Mitsubishi Zero fighters, which more than likely would have shot down the Lockheed and Douglas bombers. A very important Japanese who was in charge of the Navy was Admiral Yamamoto Isoroku. Yamamoto had studied in the United States, by the way, so he was very familiar with the U.S., and he believed, by the way, that it would be a mistake to actually attack the United States because he knew how powerful it was. He was also a believer that aircraft were going to be very important in naval wars of the time. So the idea of aircraft and aircraft carriers, he believed in them. He knew this was the way that the world's navies were going to shift. Many people in the Japanese military and government wanted him to attack Pearl Harbor. He wasn't keen on doing it. And he thought that, and many of the Japanese thought is best, that if they went ahead with this attack on Pearl Harbor, that it would at least perhaps bring the United States to the negotiation tables, perhaps keep the United States out of the war. Now, just as Yamamoto was the head of the Navy, the head of the Japanese Army was General Tojo Hideki. And Tojo became Prime Minister of Japan in October 19 1941. Things are heating up. Malaya, 90 minutes before the attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941, the Japanese attacked a British force in Malaya. And then on December 7th, 1941, they attacked Pearl Harbor. America had to respond, and to respond quickly. Commander-in-Chief of the United States Pacific Fleet for the U.S. Navy was Admiral Chester Nimitz, and he was quite important, obviously, in the Pacific theater of the war. As early as April of 1942, U.S. B-52 bombers attacked Japan from an aircraft carrier in the Doolittle raid upon Tokyo. This was the first U.S. air raid on mainland Japan, and it certainly frightened the imperial headquarters that in just a matter of months, the Americans could be attacking Japan with B-25s. The Battle of Midway was really a turning point for America and its Pacific Fleet. Admiral Yamamoto of Japan wanted to lure American aircraft carriers in its fleet out to Midway Island, and the U.S. decrypted the Japanese plan. So U.S. intelligence found out the plan, and the U.S. fleet decided to wait in ambush. The Japanese sent out reconnaissance planes which did not see the U.S. fleet, and the planes took off from U.S. aircraft carriers and achieved a U.S. victory at the Battle of Midway, and it was really a very important turning point for the war. Guadalcanal would also be another U.S. victory. In April of 1943, Admiral Yamamoto's plane was shot down and he died at age 59, which of course would also be somewhat of a turning point for the war as well. In July of 1944, the Japanese combined fleet was defeated at Saipan. The Japanese, after this defeat at Saipan, had only one aircraft carrier remaining. It still had a number of battleships, and in fact many of the people in the Navy believed that battleships were still the way to go. By October of 1944, at the Battle of Leyte in the Philippines, the Japanese fleet experienced another defeat, and by this time most of their battleships were lost as well. Things looked pretty bleak for the Japanese, and the Japanese were using then by this time kamikaze pilots. Remember when we talked about in 1274 and 1281 that the Mongols attacked Japan in massive operations and they were blown back by typhoons, which the grateful Japanese called kamikaze, spirit winds. Well, now they take on that name. Japanese kamikaze pilots were taught how to take off the planes, but not to land them. So they crashed them into American ships, etc., to cause destruction. It literally was a last-ditch effort by the Japanese in many respects. This is a very good, I think, map of the Far Eastern Theater of the War, or what we would call the Pacific Theater. And of course, you see over here Honolulu and Pearl Harbor. You see here Midway Island and where the Battle of Midway occurred. You see, we're going to be talking about Iwo Jima and Okinawa. You certainly see the Philippines where a number of the battles were going on, and there's Leyte Straits, Battle of the Philippine Sea, etc. You also see some of those islands that had been Japanese mandates after World War I, the Marianas, the Caroline Islands, the Marshall Islands, etc. Now, what do we know about shame in the Japanese military? Well, three important things. The Japanese military believed, this is the common soldier, believed that if they were captured, they would be tortured by the British, by the Americans, by the Allies. Hence, many of them preferred suicide to torture. Number two, others felt that if they surrendered, that they would lose face back home in Japan, literally bringing shame to their families. And number three, they believed that a warrior should fight to the bitter end. And this is the self-sacrificing fight for their divine emperor. Now, a lot of what wins wars is not just battles, but it's the heart and soul and spirit of the people. It's the wartime propaganda. And so don't forget to look at, as we give in the on the class Blackboard site for this week, as well as the syllabus, the propaganda film put out by the U.S. Navy in 1943 called The Enemy Japan, Its People. And of course there was propaganda going on both sides of this war, and well, indeed on all sides of the war. What do we know about Allied prisoners of war in Japanese camps? Well, they received harsh treatment. The death rate for Allied prisoners of war, like the American soldiers, for instance, was 30% in Japanese prisoner of war camps. Now, how does that compare to Japan's other Axis powers, Germany and Italy? There, the death rate for Allied POWs was less than 5%. So literally, the death rate in Japanese prisoner of war camp was 6 times what it was in German and Italian camps. The Bataan Death March in 1942 and April of 1942 underscored how cruel warfare could be. The Bataan Death March occurred in the Philippines, which of course at that time were owned by the United States. They were part of the U.S. territory. Were a territory of the United States. The Japanese moved 78,000 Filipino and American troops on a 60-mile march. These soldiers were already malnourished because of limited supplies, and the Japanese had no food or water for the POWs, and marched them at 25 miles per day. Now, under the best conditions, with enough nourishment, etc., troops can be marched at 15 to 20 miles per day, but they were marched at 25 miles a day and were very malnourished. Of the 78,000, as many as 10,000 Filipino and American soldiers died. From this area, from the northern Kentucky area, there were 2 survivors of the Death March. Dr. Alvin C. Palite, and a bridge over the Licking River is named after him that you may or may not take on your way to class, as well as a man who was a Catholic priest and later on died on a Japanese death ship by the name of Reverend Henry Stover. Japan was a society that was totally militarized, prepared for war. In Japan, all unmarried women under 25 years of age were mobilized to work in either agricultural pursuits or factories, and that was happening from September 1943 on. Already, by the end of 1943, food was scarce in Japan, and the daily intake of calories in Japan was about 1,400 calories per day, which was about half of the standard. In terms of war materiel, we know that between 1941 and 1945, Japan produced almost 59,000 aircraft. The United States in the same time period produced almost 262,000 aircraft, which was over 4 times the amount of Japan. The U.S. industrial machine was crucial in making certain that the U.S. played a major role in defeating not only Japan, but the European powers. Iwo Jima, March 1945. The U.S. captured it, which provided a convenient base midway between Saipan, where we had already won, and Japan, allowing for our long-range B-29s to make air raids against Japan. Between June of 1944 and the end of the war in August 1945, U.S. sorties, a total of 31,380 sorties were made to Japan, and in that time, only 4 B-29s were lost, less than 0.25%. Now, the biggest raid was on Tokyo on March 10th of 1945, and that resulted in almost 100,000 deaths in Tokyo. Most of the major cities in Japan were targeted, except for the very important historical cultural sites in cities like Kyoto and Nara. And some of those cities suffered as much as 40 to 50% damage to their facilities. By the end of May 1945, at least 13 million Japanese were homeless. So the air raids on Tokyo, air raids on major cities, but the Americans actually attacked a part of Japan itself with a full-scale invasion, and that was Okinawa, the island of Okinawa, part of Japan itself. The American invasion there began in April of 1945. It included 3 months of fierce fighting. 110,000 Japanese troops, 150,000 Japanese citizens died. On the American side, about 13,000 died and 40,000 were injured. These were the highest American casualty figures in the entire war. And it suggested that to some that the Japanese were going to be relentless and tenacious in their defense. The Battle of Okinawa also involved the use of some 2,000 kamikaze pilots and Japanese civilians who were panicked, jumped off in mass suicides of the cliffs in Okinawa. By this time, Harry Truman is president in the United States, and he and other world leaders issue the Potsdam Declaration, calling for unconditional surrender of Japan. Japan did not accept unconditional surrender. Surrender, that is, with no conditions. The conditions were to be made by the victors. So plans were made for the atomic attacks on Hiroshima and then later on Nagasaki. On August 6, 1945, an atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima. There were 90,000 deaths immediately. The Soviet Union entered the war against Japan 2 days later on August 8th, and a day after that, a bomb was dropped on Nagasaki on August 9th, and 50,000 people died immediately. On August 14th, in Japan, there was an indecisive meeting of the Japanese leaders. Hirohito, the emperor, cast the deciding vote to accept surrender. Some 500 military men who were against the surrender and didn't want to defy the emperor chose to commit suicide. On August 15th, it was the first time the emperor's voice had ever been heard over radio as he gave a speech saying that the Japanese would surrender. The formal instrument of surrender occurred on September 2nd, 1945, aboard the USS Missouri in Tokyo Bay. The casualties of the war were immense. Japan had suffered almost 3 million military casualties and more than 500,000 civilian casualties. It was now to undergo its first foreign occupation in the history of the Yamato state. The occupation is by American troops from 1945 to 1952. It is directed by General Douglas MacArthur, and it's going to try to do a number of things. Demythification of the emperor, having him renounce his divinity. There are refugees to be concerned about. There's demilitarization to be concerned about, democratization, breakup of the Zaibatsu. But you can find out about this with wonderful footage of the time period by going and following the links to the Pacific Century, which you've seen one part of already. And this is a very, I think, interesting title for this portion of it, called Reinventing Japan. And learn all about the Constitution, which America, wrote for the Japanese, and especially Article 9, the renunciation of war and armaments, and also what happens in terms of reform of the time period, educational reform, and then when all of a sudden things seem to be becoming too leftist, the reverse course which America chooses for Japan, and also a little bit about the United States-Japan Security Treaty. Any questions, feel free to email or phone me. I'm always happy to help. Have a good week.